She married the most feared duke to save her family. On wedding night, his touch left her speechless. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. On a cold, wind-swept evening, Amelia Hart sat by the narrow window of her family's worn townhouse, staring at the last few coins lined up on the table. The glass rattled every time the wind hit it, making the small living room feel thinner, more fragile, as if one strong gust could peel the walls away and expose how close they were to losing everything. In the next room, her mother coughed, a dry, stubborn sound that never seemed to end. Her younger sister had fallen asleep at the foot of the bed, still wearing her mended dress, a book clutched against her chest. Amelia's father, Thomas Hart, stood in the center of the room with a letter in his hand, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen when she was a child. "Amelia," he said, voice rough, "they've sold the debt." She rose slowly. "Sold it? To whom?" He lifted his eyes to hers, and in that one look she knew the answer would change the rest of her life. "To the Duke of Ashbourne," he whispered. "To Damien Blackwood." The name seemed to darken the room. Even the candle on the table flickered lower, as if afraid. Everyone in their coastal town had heard stories about the Duke, whose estate sat on the cliffs beyond the harbor. People called him the most feared Duke in the country, a man with a temper sharp enough to ruin a man's livelihood with a single word. Children dared each other to walk near his iron gates. Women lowered their voices when his name passed their lips. Some said he had lost his wife in a tragic accident at his estate and had never been the same since. Others claimed he had no heart left at all. Amelia swallowed hard. There must be another lender. Someone else we can appeal to. Her father shook his head. The amount is too high. No one will touch it now that his name is on the papers. As if summoned by the weight of that name, the sound of carriage wheels scraped across the cobblestones outside. A knock came at the door, 3 measured, precise knocks that did not belong to a neighbor. Thomas exchanged a helpless glance with Amelia before opening it. A tall man in a dark coat stood on the threshold, snowflakes clinging to his shoulders, a leather folder tucked under his arm. His posture was straight, his expression carefully neutral. "Good evening," he said. "I am Mr. Collins, steward to His Grace, Damien Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne. I believe you are expecting news regarding your obligations." The word obligations cut through the air like a chill. Amelia stepped closer, feeling the rough wood floor beneath her thin shoes. "What does he want?" she asked, because someone had to. Mr. Collins studied her face for a brief moment, as if taking note of her composure, then opened the folder and spread several documents across the table, right beside the little line of coins. "His Grace is prepared to clear all outstanding debts owed by Mr. Thomas Hart," he said calmly. "In full." Immediately, her father's hand trembled, reaching for the first page. "But why?" "There is a condition," Mr. Collins continued. His eyes moved back to Amelia. "In exchange, His Grace requires a bride. Specifically, you, Miss Amelia Hart. The marriage ceremony is to be formal and legal, and it must take place within 7 days." The room went completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Amelia felt her heart beat once, hard, against her ribs. Married to the most feared duke in the country. Married to a stranger whose name alone made grown men lower their voices. She glanced at her mother's closed door, at her sister's small shoes beside the bed, at her father's lined face. She knew what would happen if she refused. Jail for her father, disgrace for the entire family. Her sister pulled out of school, their home lost. "If I agree," she asked quietly, "my family's debt is gone?" Mr. Collins nodded. "Erased. Your father and siblings will be secure under the Duke's protection. His word is binding." Amelia's throat tightened. It was not the proposal of a suitor, it was a transaction, an exchange sealed with ink instead of affection. Still, behind the cold wording, she heard something else. A door opening where every other door had slammed shut. Her hands were cold as she took the pen. The paper in front of her spelled out the bargain in careful legal terms, but what she saw between the lines was simple, her future for their safety. She did not ask for time to think. She had already made the choice the moment she imagined her family without a roof over their heads. With one steady breath, Amelia's heart bent over the contract. The tip of the pen touched the paper, and she signed her name beneath the tight black letters that bound her to Damien Blackwood, the Duke of Ashbourne, the man people whispered about in fear. As the ink dried, she understood that this was more than a signature. It was the first step toward a wedding no girl would ever dream of, and a wedding night that would leave her more speechless than any of the rumors ever could. The wedding day arrived faster than anyone in the Hart household could truly believe, as if time itself had been hurried along by the Duke's signature. One moment Amelia was standing in their narrow living room, ink still drying beneath her name, and the next she was staring at her reflection in a small chipped mirror as her sister tried to smooth the wrinkles from a simple ivory gown that had been delivered from Ashbourne Hall. It was not a gown woven with jewels or endless lace, but it was finer than anything Amelia had ever worn. The fabric felt unfamiliar beneath her fingers, like a life that did not belong to her. Outside, carriage wheels rolled over the uneven street. The sound drew closer until it seemed to fill the entire house. Her mother sat propped up against pillows, eyes damp but shining with a strange pride. "You do not have to smile," she whispered when Amelia knelt beside the bed. "But hold your head high. No matter what people say, you are not being taken. You are walking into this by choice, for us." Amelia pressed her forehead gently to her mother's hand, taking in the warmth, the faint scent of lavender that still clung to her skin. "I will be fine," she said, more to steady herself than to reassure anyone else. Her father waited at the door, hat in his hands, twisting the brim as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. When they stepped outside, Amelia saw the carriage that bore the Duke's crest. It was a dark, polished thing with lanterns hooked to its sides, glowing softly in the gray morning light. Mr. Collins stood beside it, gloved hands folded. His gaze swept over her with the cautious respect of a man who understood that this young woman was now tied to power, even if she did not yet wear it comfortably. The town seemed to hold its breath. Neighbors watched from behind curtains or from stoops, pretending to sweep or fix shutters. Amelia could feel their eyes on her veil, on her plain shoes, on the way her father's shoulders sagged. As she stepped into the carriage, she heard a whispered fragment drift across the street. "Poor girl. I hope she knows what she is walking into." The journey to Ashbourne Hall felt both endless and far too short. The road wound along the coast, where cliffs rose sharp and dark above a restless sea. The estate came into view slowly, its stone walls and tall towers cutting a severe shape against the overcast sky. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something inside. When the carriage stopped, the door opened to reveal a set of wide stone steps and an archway framed by heavy wooden doors. Servants lined the entrance in two silent rows, their uniforms immaculate, their eyes carefully lowered. The air smelled faintly of salt and distant rain. In the chapel on the grounds, candles had been lit in tall iron holders, their small flames flickering against dark wooden beams and pale stone. There were flowers, but not many. White lilies lined the aisle in modest arrangements, their fragrance soft but lingering. The pews were filled with faces Amelia did not know. Lords, ladies, wealthy merchants, all dressed in rich fabrics that whispered when they moved. She felt every gaze as she walked forward on her father's arm. At the far end of the aisle, beneath the arch of the altar, he waited. Damien Blackwood, Duke of Ashbourne. He was taller than she had imagined, his dark hair combed back from a face marked by a thin scar along his cheek, a reminder of a past no one spoke of openly. His eyes were a cool gray, steady and unreadable. His clothing was formal and dark, the cut of his coat emphasizing the disciplined lines of a man accustomed to command. As Amelia approached, their eyes met. There was no warmth in his expression, but there was something else, something she could not yet name. Not indifference, exactly. More like a guarded awareness, as if he had spent years building walls around himself, and was now watching to see if she would try to climb any of them. Her father placed her hand in his, and for the first time she felt the touch of the man she was about to marry. His hand was warm through the glove, steady, his grip firm but not crushing. It surprised her. She had expected coldness in his touch to match his reputation. Instead, there was a quiet strength, restrained and controlled. The vows were spoken clearly but without embellishment. The priest's voice echoed softly under the high ceiling as he asked each question that would bind them together in the eyes of the law and of society. When it was Damien's turn to answer, he said, "I do," with calm certainty, as if he were signing another contract rather than pledging himself to a stranger. When it was Amelia's turn, her heart beat so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. She spoke the same words, her voice soft yet steady, feeling each syllable settle over her like a new name she had not yet grown into. A band of cool metal slid onto her finger. Applause did not break out when the ceremony ended. Instead, there was a rustle of fabric, a murmur of whispers, the quiet weight of many opinions being formed and traded in low voices. As they walked back down the aisle together, arm in arm, Amelia could not help but hear snatches of conversation. "She is very young. The second Duchess of Ashbourne. Let us hope this one fares better than the first." The words brushed against her like cold wind. Beside her, Damien did not react. His posture remained perfectly straight, his gaze fixed forward. She wondered how many times he had heard such remarks, and what kind of person one had to become in order to endure them without even a visible flinch. When they stepped out of the chapel, the sky was beginning to clear, thin threads of pale sunlight breaking through the clouds. The air felt crisper, sharper, as if the world itself knew a line had been crossed. Amelia Hart had entered Ashbourne as the daughter of a debtor. She was leaving this ceremony as the Duchess of Ashbourne, wife to a man whose name carried both protection and fear in equal measure, and whose true character she had only begun to glimpse through the brief, unexpected warmth of his hand in hers. The reception that followed felt less like a celebration and more like a test. Inside the great hall of Ashbourne, long tables had been prepared with polished silver and crystal that caught the candlelight in sharp, glittering flashes. High above, a painted ceiling disappeared into shadow, and tapestries lined the stone walls, their faded scenes of battles and feasts staring down at the assembled guests. Amelia walked at Damien's side, her arm lightly resting against his, aware of every step. The silk of her gown whispered against the floor, almost swallowed by the hum of quiet conversations and the soft clink of glass. Servants moved gracefully between the tables, offering dishes that looked as if they belonged in someone else's world. Amelia barely tasted the food. She sat at the head of the table, the place of honor beside the Duke, and felt as though she were on display. Laughter and polite remarks drifted up from the guests below, but underneath the surface she could sense curiosity and doubt pressing in from all directions. Every now and then, a name or a phrase reached her clearly. "The new Duchess. A merchant's daughter, I heard. Such a delicate thing for this house." The words brushed against her skin, leaving a faint sting. Damien spoke little, answering only when addressed directly. His posture remained composed, his gaze measured and distant. Once, when a portly gentleman with an impressively thick mustache raised his glass and said loudly, "To a fruitful union, Your Grace. May this wife bring you more peace than the last." Amelia felt the entire hall tighten. A hush followed, subtle but unmistakable. She felt dozens of eyes slide toward Damien, then toward her, as if everyone were waiting to see how the second Duchess would respond. Before she could react, Damien inclined his head slightly, his tone even. "Your good wishes are noted," he said. "May the evening remain pleasant for everyone." The words were courteous, but the undercurrent of authority in his voice closed the subject so completely that no one dared add to it. The gentleman laughed awkwardly and turned back to his plate. Amelia let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. At one point, a woman in a deep blue gown leaned across the table toward a friend and murmured, just loud enough for Amelia to hear, "She looks like her, does she not?" Around the eyes. The reply floated back in a hushed tone. "Yes. I hope this resemblance does not bring the same fate." Amelia's fingers tightened in her lap. She looked down at the lace of her gloves, focusing on the delicate pattern so she would not give away the twisting in her chest. She knew they spoke of the first Duchess, the woman whose story hung over this house like a shadow. When the meal finally ended and the last toast was made, musicians began to play in a corner, offering a graceful waltz for those who wished to dance. Guests drifted toward the open space in the center of the hall. Damien stood and turned to Amelia. This is usually the part where the couple leads the first dance, he said quietly, so that only she could hear. However, you are not obliged if you do not wish to. She met his gaze, surprised by the consideration. If I refuse, will it cause talk? He lifted one shoulder in a measured hint of a shrug. There will be talk whatever we do. That is the nature of these gatherings. His honesty disarmed her. For a moment she hesitated, then placed her hand in his. Then we might as well give them something graceful to talk about, she replied. The faintest hint of approval touched his eyes, gone almost as soon as she noticed it. On the dance floor, his hand settled at her waist with careful distance, his other hand enclosing hers. He led with firm precision, guiding her through the steps so smoothly that she barely had to think. Despite herself, Amelia began to relax, the movement of the waltz drawing her attention away from the murmurs at the edge of the room. When she risked a glance up, she saw that Damien was not looking at the guests or even at their reflection in the tall windows. He was watching her, as if trying to read something behind her controlled expression. You are very calm, given the circumstances, he said. Most people would be shaking. I am, she answered honestly. Just not where anyone can see it. For an instant, the corner of his mouth moved, almost forming a smile, but it did not quite appear. When the music ended, he led her from the floor with the same steady composure. One by one, guests began to take their leave, offering polite bows and practiced compliments. At last, as the hour grew late and the candles burned lower in their sconces, Mr. Collins approached with a discreet bow. Your Grace, the rooms are prepared. The meaning in his words was clear. Amelia felt heat rush to her face even as the rest of her body went cold. The wedding night. Duty. Expectation. She had known this moment would come, had tried to steel herself for it. But now, as Damien escorted her through the long corridors of Ashbourne Hall, each footstep sounded louder than it should. The walls were lined with portraits in heavy frames, faces from generations past staring down with knowing eyes. At the end of one hall, he paused by a tall wooden door carved with intricate patterns and opened it for her. The bedchamber beyond was wide and high, with a large four-poster bed, its curtains drawn back, and a fire burning low in the hearth. Golden light from the flames softened the severity of the stone walls, painting the room in warm shadows. Amelia stepped inside, her heart beating hard, every sense heightened. She heard the soft click of the door closing behind them and knew they were alone. For a brief, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Then Damien removed his gloves, laying them with deliberate care on a nearby table. When he turned back to her, his expression was not cold, but it was serious. I am aware, he began slowly, that this is not the wedding night most young women imagine for themselves. The honesty in that simple sentence caught her more off guard than any display of authority could have. She folded her hands together to keep them from trembling. I did not have much time to imagine anything, she replied. There were more urgent matters occupying my mind. Your family, he said. It was not a question. She nodded. He took a few steps closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance enough that she could see the fine lines near his eyes, the faint weariness at the edges of his composed features. He raised one hand slowly, giving her every chance to flinch or step back. Instead, she held still, though her breath caught in her throat. His fingers brushed along her wrist, just above the edge of her glove. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, as if he were afraid of his own strength. Heat spread from that single point of contact, a quiet, startling warmth that traveled up her arm. Amelia had braced herself for something harsh, for possession without tenderness. Instead, this careful touch left her utterly unprepared. He turned her hand palm up and rested it lightly against his chest, over the steady beat of his heart through the layers of fabric. There are many things people say about me, he said, his voice low. Some of them are true. Many are not. But I will not be the man who takes what is not freely given, not even under a lawful contract. The words tangled with the pulse beneath her fingers. For the first time, she could feel that his calm exterior was not emptiness, but control, a deliberate stillness over something deeper. She tried to speak, to say that she understood, or that she did not, or that she was grateful, but no sound came. The knot of fear, relief, and unexpected respect lodged in her throat, stealing her voice more completely than any shout could have. He watched her for a long moment, then gently lowered her hand. "We will share this room," he said, "but I will sleep over there." He nodded toward a long upholstered chaise near the hearth. "When you look at me and no longer see only the man from the stories, then we will discuss the rest. Until then, you owe me nothing beyond your presence under this roof." Amelia could only stare at him, wide-eyed, her thoughts racing too fast to take shape. She had never felt so vulnerable, and yet in this unexpected restraint there was a strange sense of safety. In the quiet that followed, the crackling of the fire and the distant sigh of the sea were the only sounds. Her new husband had touched her with such care that it chased away the worst of the tales she had been told, leaving her speechless, not from fear, but from the realization that the most feared man in the country might not be a monster at all, but a man carrying a burden she did not yet understand. Morning light slipped through the heavy curtains in thin, cautious lines, tracing pale stripes across the floorboards of the bedchamber. When Amelia opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the empty chaise near the hearth, a folded blanket resting neatly on its arm. Damien was gone. For a moment she lay very still, listening. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few glowing embers, and somewhere distant in the house a clock chimed the hour. It took her a second to remember where she was, who she now was, and what had happened the night before. She lifted her hand and looked at the simple band on her finger, its presence both reassuring and unnerving. On the small writing desk near the window, she noticed a piece of paper weighed down by a silver pen. Curiosity drew her up from the bed. Barefoot, she crossed the room and unfolded the note. The handwriting was steady, a strong script with clean lines. "The steward will escort you to breakfast when you are ready. There are matters of the household we should discuss later today. Until then, you are free to explore any part of the East Wing. D. Blackwood." It was not warm, not particularly personal, but it was not unkind. There was a quiet consideration in the way he had made certain she would not feel abandoned or lost on her first morning in a place that was now, at least in name, her home. After dressing in a modest day gown and taming her hair with the help of a maid, Amelia stepped into the corridor outside her room. The hall stretched in both directions, lined with tall windows on one side and portraits on the other. The faces in the frames watched her as she passed, generations of Blackwoods captured in oil paint, their expressions serious and composed. Mr. Collins appeared from around a corner with his usual precise timing. "Your Grace," he said with a courteous bow that still felt strange to her. "If you would follow me, the morning room has been prepared." As they walked, Amelia tried to memorize the turns, the placement of doors, the subtle differences in the carpets and wall coverings. She did not want to be a stranger wandering through her own home. Near the base of a wide staircase, she noticed a corridor sealed by a pair of dark wooden doors. There were no candles lit along that passage, no runners on the floor. It looked as if that entire section of the house had been set aside, untouched. "What lies down there?" she asked quietly. Mr. Collins slowed for only a second before answering. "That is the West Wing, Your Grace. It is currently closed." "Closed," she repeated. "For what reason?" His eyes flicked toward the doors and then away again. "The Duke has deemed it unnecessary for the time being. The East and Central Wings contain all that is needed for daily life. If you require additional rooms or changes, of course, arrangements can be made." It was a polite answer and a careful one. Amelia said nothing more, but the image of those dim doors stayed with her as they continued on. The morning room was smaller than the great hall, with lower ceilings and large windows that looked out toward the sea. The light here was softer, the air touched by a faint breeze that carried the salt scent of the water below. A table had been set near the window with tea, fresh bread, fruit, and a few simple dishes. It was far more than she was used to seeing at breakfast, yet clearly a modest spread by Ashbourne standards. Another figure was already there, seated in a high-backed chair with a cup in hand. The woman rose gracefully when Amelia entered. She was perhaps in her late 30s, with dark hair arranged neatly and eyes that missed very little. Her gown was elegant but not overly adorned, a deep shade of green that suited her serious expression. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head just enough to be respectful without seeming servile. "Allow me to welcome you properly to Ashbourne. I am Lady Margaret Ashford, cousin to His Grace." "It is a pleasure to meet you," Amelia replied, measuring her tone. Lady Margaret smiled, but there was something guarded in it, as though she had learned long ago to keep her true thoughts behind a refined exterior. As they sat and exchanged polite remarks about the journey and the coastal weather, Amelia sensed that the conversation was as much an assessment as it was an introduction. Lady Margaret asked about her family, her interests, the town where she had been raised. Each answer Amelia gave was met with a thoughtful nod, as if the older woman were quietly assembling a picture of her piece by piece. Eventually, Amelia could not ignore the question pressing at the edge of her thoughts. "Lady Margaret," she began carefully, "may I ask something that others have only whispered about?" The older woman's gaze sharpened, but she did not look offended. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer." "The previous Duchess," Amelia said softly. "People speak of her in half-sentences. They say I resemble her." Lady Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup before she set it down with deliberate care. For a moment she looked out the window, where the light broke across the waves, before turning back. "Eliza was very beautiful," she said. "She had a way of entering a room and making everyone feel as though the world had just become a little more interesting. In that sense, I suppose there is a resemblance. You draw attention, whether you intend to or not." There was more behind those words, but Amelia waited. Lady Margaret sighed, the sound quiet but weighed down. "It is true that her time here ended tragically. It is also true that people prefer a dramatic story over a complicated truth. They say many things about my cousin because it is easier than admitting that sometimes terrible events are not the work of a villain, but of 100 small choices and one unlucky moment." So he did not. Amelia let the unfinished question hang, unsure how far she was allowed to go. Lady Margaret's eyes met hers squarely. "I will tell you this, Duchess. I have known Damien since he was a boy. He has made mistakes, as every person with power does. But the man I know would rather suffer himself than deliberately bring harm to someone under his protection. Whatever else you hear, remember that." The words settled in Amelia's chest like a stone and a feather. At the same time, heavy and strangely light. Before she could respond, a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "Breakfast agrees with you, I see." Damien stood there, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe, his expression unreadable, though there was a glint in his eyes that had not been there the night before. As he stepped into the room, Amelia felt again the echo of his careful touch from the previous evening and the way it had stripped the fear from her voice, leaving her with something far more dangerous: the desire to understand the truth behind the stories that surrounded him, and the locked doors that still waited in the shadows of his house. Damien crossed the room with the ease of someone who belonged to every inch of it. Yet something in his manner suggested he would have preferred to be anywhere else than the center of polite attention. Lady Margaret greeted him with practiced warmth, then excused herself with the claim of correspondence that could not wait, leaving Amelia alone at the small table with her husband. For a few heartbeats, the only sound between them was the quiet clink of porcelain as he poured himself a cup of tea. "I trust the house has not overwhelmed you already," he said at last, his tone lightened by a trace of dry humor. "It has a way of making new arrivals feel as though it is appraising them." Amelia glanced toward the windows, where the sea stretched out under a pale sky. "It is very different from what I am used to," she admitted. "But it is not unkind. Simply large." That earned the barest hint of a smile. "It has stood for a very long time. Old walls forget how to be small." He set his cup down, studying her with that steady gray gaze. "There is a matter I should mention. Each winter, Ashbourne hosts a gathering for a select portion of the county. It is less grand than some assume, but it serves its purpose. This year, our marriage gives them an excuse to be especially curious." "A gathering," she repeated slowly. "You mean a formal evening? A ball?" "If you wish to call it that, yes," he replied. "I would not demand that you enjoy it, but I must ask that you endure it. People who trade in rumors prefer to see their subjects in person." There was something almost apologetic beneath his words, a quiet acknowledgement that he was leading her into a room where she would be carefully examined from every angle. "Very well," she said. "If it must be done, it is better to face it than run from it." His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, approval flickering like a brief spark. "You may rely on Lady Margaret for the details. She knows which customs are truly important and which are only decorative." The days that followed moved with a steady rhythm. Amelia began to learn the paths through the East Wing, to recognize the pattern of bells that marked the hours, to distinguish between the footsteps of different servants in the halls. She spent a morning in the gardens with the head gardener, discussing which plants could endure the sea air. Another afternoon, she walked with Lady Margaret through the picture gallery, listening to quiet stories of long-gone Blackwoods whose faces watched them from ornate frames. Yet no matter where she went, her gaze seemed to drift back toward the closed west wing, where the air always felt a little cooler and the silence a little deeper. When the evening of the gathering arrived, Ashbourne transformed. Lamps burned brighter, casting warm light across polished floors. Musicians tuned their instruments in the corner of the great hall, their notes drifting through the air like hints of a coming storm. Guests began to arrive in a procession of carriages, cloaked figures stepping out onto the gravel drive and ascending the front steps with the confident steps of people accustomed to being welcomed. Amelia stood at the top of those steps beside Damien, gloved hands folded, a gown of soft silver blue falling in smooth lines from her shoulders. The color had been Lady Margaret's choice. "It will remind them of the sea," she had said. "Calm on the surface, with more depth than they expect." One by one, names were announced. Amelia greeted each guest with measured politeness, aware of the way their eyes flicked from her face to Damien's, then back again, as if comparing what they saw with what they had heard. Some offered genuine kindness, others thinly veiled curiosity. And then the steward's voice rose above the hum. "Lord Everett Harrow." The name cut through the noise like a quiet chord. A tall man with golden brown hair and a charming smile approached, his coat impeccably tailored, his manner relaxed in a way that spoke of long familiarity with grand houses. His eyes, a shade too bright, took in the room before settling on Amelia with open appraisal. "Your Grace," he said to Damien, bowing with the precise amount of respect required. "You have been busy since I last saw you. And this must be the new Duchess of Ashbourne." He took Amelia's hand lightly, his grip lingering a heartbeat longer than necessary before he released it. "Lord Everett," Damien said, his voice polite, yet cooler than the air outside. "I see that invitations travel more swiftly than I remember." Everett laughed softly. "News travels swiftly. I merely followed it." To Amelia, he added, "I have heard much about this house and the tragedies that have touched it, but I am pleased to see that it remembers how to be splendid." There was an almost imperceptible pause where a colder word could have fit, but he smoothed over it with a pleasant expression. Throughout the evening, Amelia observed him at a distance. Lord Everett moved easily among the guests, trading stories and compliments with practiced charm. People seemed drawn to him, leaning in when he spoke, laughing at his comments. Yet when his gaze returned to her, there was a sharpness beneath the surface, a measuring look that did not match his effortless smile. Later, when the music swelled and couples began to drift toward the wide staircase that led to a balcony overlooking the hall, he approached Amelia with a glass of punch in hand. "Your Grace," he said, "I promise I mean no impropriety, but may I suggest a moment of fresh air above the crowd? The view from the upper gallery is truly something when the chandeliers are lit." She hesitated, feeling that instinctive prickle of caution, but before she needed to answer, Damien appeared at her side. "The gallery can be appreciated another time," he said evenly. "For now, my wife has other introductions to make." Everett's eyes flickered between them, a hint of something unreadable passing through them before he inclined his head. "Of course, another time, then." He withdrew with an easy smile. But Amelia could not shake the feeling that beneath the smooth conversation and polished manners, there were undercurrents she did not yet understand. As the evening wore on, she stepped briefly onto one of the smaller balconies that overlooked the main hall, seeking a moment of quiet. The rail under her hand felt cool and solid, yet when she leaned the slightest bit forward, she noticed the faintest creak in the wood. It was nothing alarming, just enough to draw her attention. She stepped back at once, instincts whispering that in this house of old stories and new whispers, even the smallest details deserved to be noticed. When she turned, she found Damien watching her from the doorway, his expression calm, but his eyes fixed not on her face, but on the place where her hand had rested on the rail. "Some parts of this house," he said quietly, "were not built to bear too much weight. I would be grateful if you keep to the center of the rooms when you can." It was a simple remark on the surface, but Amelia heard the unspoken concern beneath it, and something else as well, something almost protective. In that moment, surrounded by music and murmurs from below, she realized that the evening had not only been an introduction to society, but a glimpse of the alliances and tensions that shaped the world she had married into, and of the careful steps she would need to take if she wished to remain standing in it. The days after the gathering unfolded with a strange mixture of quiet routine and invisible tension, like a calm sea with strong currents running deep beneath the surface. Amelia learned to greet familiar faces among the staff, to anticipate the times when the light would turn golden along the eastern windows, to expect the faint scent of sea air whenever a door was opened to the terrace. Yet even as she settled into the rhythm of Ashbourne, she could not quite shake the memory of Lord Everett's gaze tracking her from across the great hall, warm on the surface and cool beneath. One morning, as she sat at the small writing desk in her room, sorting through a few letters from her family, a new envelope appeared among them. There was no familiar seal, only her name written in a hand she did not recognize. The letters were narrow and slightly slanted, the ink a little darker than the rest. She hesitated before breaking the wax. Inside, on a single, folded sheet, were a few lines that made the room feel suddenly colder. Duchess, some debts are never truly erased. There are people who would be very interested to know that the Hart family now rests under the protection of Ashbourne. Be careful whose protection you rely on. Those you love may yet pay a price. There was no signature, no address, just that unsettling suggestion, like a shadow slipping under a door. Amelia read the words twice, then a third time, hoping she had misunderstood, but the meaning did not change. Her first thought was of her father and sister, of their small house and the life they were rebuilding under the shelter of the Duke's name. If someone wished to harm Damien, what better way than through the people who had become tied to him by marriage? She folded the letter back upon itself, her hands steady even as her heart clenched. She considered taking it directly to Damien, but something in her resisted the idea of appearing frightened by an anonymous threat. Instead, she sought out Lady Margaret in the morning room. The older woman listened in silence as Amelia described the envelope and repeated the lines from memory. "You are certain there was no seal, no mark at all?" Lady Margaret asked. "None that I recognized," Amelia replied. The handwriting felt deliberate, as though the writer wished to appear calm. "Then we may assume they wished to unsettle you more than to inform you," Lady Margaret said slowly. "People who mean immediate harm seldom send warnings first. They prefer surprise." "That is not entirely comforting," Amelia admitted. "It was not meant to be. It was meant to be honest." Lady Margaret's gaze softened. "You may show the letter to Damien. Whether or not you choose to do so, I would advise you not to travel anywhere alone for a while. Even small gestures of caution can make a difference." That afternoon, Amelia suggested sending a short note to her family to inquire discreetly after their well-being. Damien agreed at once, his expression unreadable as he sat across from her in the study, a room lined with shelves of ledgers and legal volumes. "You may send as many letters as you need," he said. "If there is any sign of trouble, I will move them to a safer location without delay." The calm certainty in his voice eased part of the knot in her chest, but not all of it. 2 days later, restless and unable to endure the weight of the house's closed spaces, Amelia requested a ride into the nearby village to visit the chapel and deliver a small donation in person. Damien hesitated, then agreed on the condition that she take a groom with her and remain on the main road. "The weather is clear enough," he said, glancing toward the pale sky outside the window. "But the coastal paths can be unpredictable even on the best days. I would rather not test them." The air was crisp when she set out, the horse beneath her well-trained and steady. The groom, a quiet young man named Peter, rode a short distance behind, giving her the illusion of solitude without leaving her unaccompanied. The path curved along the edge of low cliffs, then dipped toward a stand of trees that bordered the road leading into the village. For a while, the only sounds were the rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the distant rush of the sea. As they neared the cluster of trees, Amelia became aware of another sound behind them, faint at first, then clearer. The steady, deliberate beat of another horse, keeping pace just far enough back to remain unseen. She glanced over her shoulder and caught a glimpse of a rider in a dark coat, face shadowed by the brim of a hat. The figure kept to the edge of the path, neither approaching nor falling away. "Peter," she called. keeping her tone as even as she could. "Do you see that rider?" The groom turned, his brow furrowing. "Yes, your grace. He has been behind us for some time. Perhaps he is simply bound for the village as well." Perhaps, Amelia thought, but the letter's words whispered at the edge of her mind. The path narrowed as it curved around a gentle descent, and a small stone had shifted into the road, barely visible. Her horse's hoof clipped it, and the animal stumbled slightly, tossing its head. She tightened her grip on the reins at once, urging calm, speaking softly to soothe the animal. The horse responded, slowing, but the brief misstep sent a sharp jolt of unease through her body. The rider behind them seemed to close the distance in that moment, his horse drawing nearer. Before anything more could happen, another sound carried across the air, firm and unmistakable. The approach of a third horse, coming from ahead this time. Amelia looked up to see Damien riding toward them, his coat dark against the pale road, his figure straight and controlled in the saddle. Relief moved through her so quickly that it left her almost lightheaded. When he reached them, his gaze swept over her, then over Peter, then to the shadowed rider behind. The man in the dark coat slowed, then turned his horse with a practiced motion and retreated along the path without a word, disappearing the way he had come. Damien watched him go, the line of his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, then returned his attention to Amelia. "The roads are less empty than they appear," he said gently. "I think, for now, any errands you wish to run can be brought to you instead. There is no need for you to place yourself where others may test the limits of my patience." His choice of words was mild, but Amelia could feel the concern running beneath them, as real as the reins in her hands. In that moment, she realized that whatever forces were moving around Ashbourne, they were no longer content to remain as whispers in the corners. They had begun to circle closer, and she was standing in the center of their slow, deliberate orbit. That evening, Ashbourne felt more watchful than ever. Lamps burned a little longer in the corridors, and Amelia noticed that the footmen seemed to appear more often at corners and doorways, as if the house itself had decided to keep an extra eye on whoever moved through it. After returning from the interrupted ride, she had changed out of her riding habit with fingers that would not quite stay steady. The image of the rider turning away in silence lingered in her mind like a half-remembered line from a troubling dream. Later, passing by the study, she heard the low murmur of voices through the half-closed door. One of them was Damien's, calm, yet edged with something firmer than usual. The other she recognized after a moment as Lord Everett's smooth, easy tone. "You are becoming very protective of your new Duchess," Everett remarked, the words drifting clearly enough for her to catch. "One might almost think you were afraid of losing her." "I am simply aware," Damien replied, "that there are people who confuse curiosity with entitlement. I prefer my family to remain out of their experiments." Everett laughed softly. "Family. That is a generous word for an arrangement born from ink and obligation." There was a pause, and Amelia could almost feel the air tighten. When Damien spoke again, his voice had gone quiet in a way that made her listen even more closely. "Obligation does not prevent care," he said, "nor does it erase the past. Some of us have learned, at cost, that certain patterns cannot be allowed to repeat." Everett's answer came back light and unbothered. "You speak as if the past were a room that could be locked and forgotten. Houses like this never forget, Damien. They keep every echo, every choice. The question is simply who hears them." She stepped away before she could hear more, the conversation sitting uneasily in her thoughts. The mention of patterns and rooms made her eyes turn again toward the west wing whenever she crossed the central hall. 2 nights later, when the house had gone mostly quiet and the last of the evening lamps were being extinguished, Amelia found herself standing near the darkened corridor that led to the closed section. The doors at its entrance were not locked, she discovered, merely drawn together as if by habit. Her candle cast a narrow circle of light as she slipped through, the flame trembling in the faint draft. The west wing felt different from the rest of Ashbourne. The air held a faint scent of dust and something floral that had faded with time. White cloths covered some of the furniture, turning familiar shapes into ghostly outlines. Amelia moved slowly, her footsteps muffled by carpets that had not felt regular passage in some time. At the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar. Her hand hovered over the handle for a moment before she eased it open. The room inside was a bedchamber, delicate in its design, with soft colors now muted by shadow. A dressing table stood near the window, and upon it lay a small silver hairbrush and a ribbon, neatly folded, as if set down and never picked up again. Amelia's breath caught. The space felt suspended, as though it were waiting for someone who would never return. Beyond the bedchamber, another smaller door opened onto a bathing room. The porcelain tiles on the floor were smooth and pale, one of them faintly cracked near the edge. When she ran her fingers along the wall, she felt a set of shallow marks, as if someone's hand had slid there at some point, searching for balance. Nothing was obvious, nothing dramatic, yet the room hummed with the sense that something important had once happened there and then been carefully folded into silence. "You should not be in this part of the house, child." The voice made her turn sharply. Mrs. Doyle, the older housekeeper she had seen in passing, stood in the doorway, her expression kind but cautious. Her hands were clasped together, and her eyes held a mix of concern and resignation. "I am sorry," Amelia said. "I did not mean to intrude. I just thought." "You thought that if you saw where she lived, you might understand more about how she left," Mrs. Doyle finished gently. "You are not the first to wonder, but you are the first to come here with that ring on your hand." She stepped into the room, smoothing a cloth on the back of a chair, as if tidying what did not truly need tidying. "There was a great deal of talking after that night," she continued softly. "People like to shape what they do not know into stories they can pass along. I will tell you only this. The young mistress who had this room was troubled in ways that did not begin and end with the Duke. There was more than one voice raised before the house went quiet, and not all of them belonged to him." "Then why does everyone speak as if he alone is to blame?" Amelia asked. Mrs. Doyle's gaze shifted to the window, where the moonlight traced pale lines across the glass. "Because it is easier," she said, "and because he let them. Sometimes carrying the weight of a story is simpler than pulling it apart in public." Before Amelia could ask more, a faint sound drifted in from the distance, a sharp crack followed by a low shout. Mrs. Doyle's head lifted at once. "Do you smell that?" she murmured. Amelia paused, then caught it. The thin, unmistakable scent of smoke threading into the air. They left the west wing together, moving quickly back toward the central hall. As they approached one of the side doors that led toward the stable yard, she saw a faint orange glow against the night sky. Her heartbeat jumped, but by the time they reached the open doorway, several stable hands were already at work. A stack of straw near the outer wall had begun to smolder, sending up a worrying plume, but buckets of water and quick hands were containing it before it could spread. No animals had been harmed, and the main structure remained untouched, but the message was clear enough. Something that should have been still had been set alight. Damien stood a short distance away, speaking in low tones to the head groom. When he turned and saw Amelia watching from the threshold, his expression tightened with concern, then relief that she was unharmed. A small scrap of dark fabric fluttered on a nail near the stable door, caught there as if by accident. As the commotion settled, Amelia stepped closer and saw that the cloth was of fine quality, the sort used for evening cloaks, not work garments. She did not recognize it completely, but something about the shade and weave called to mind the effortless elegance of a man who moved through crowded rooms with a practiced smile and bright, watchful eyes. Without drawing attention, she closed her fingers around the scrap and slipped it into her glove. The night at Ashbourne was once again turning dark and still, but for Amelia, the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt like the pause between one revelation and the next, and she knew that whoever had sent that warning letter no longer intended to remain a distant shadow. By morning, the scrap of fabric in Amelia's glove felt heavier than any piece of cloth ought to feel. She placed it on the small table in her room and studied it in the clear daylight. The weave was too fine for a servant's cloak, the color a deep, particular shade that brought to mind the garments she had seen gliding through the great hall at the gathering. When she turned it slightly, she caught the faint outline of an embroidered edge, the kind added more for style than for warmth. It was not proof of anything on its own, but it was a thread, and she had learned enough in this house to know that one pulled thread could sometimes reveal the whole pattern. She found Damien in the study, going through a stack of correspondence with the familiar focus that always made him seem slightly removed from the room around him. At her knock, he looked up at once. "Amelia," he said, setting his pen aside. You are awake early. She crossed the room and laid the small piece of fabric on the desk between them. This was caught on a nail near the stable door last night, she said. The fire may have been contained quickly, but I do not believe the straw began to burn on its own. His eyes lowered to the cloth, and something in his expression hardened in a quiet, controlled way. He picked it up, turning it between his fingers. You have seen this color before, she added. At the gathering. He did not deny it. There are several men in our circle who favor this shade, he said slowly. But only one who thinks himself clever enough to stir trouble in another man's house, while smiling over his glass. Lord Everett, she said, giving the suspicion a name. Damien let out a breath that was almost a sigh. Everett has always enjoyed testing boundaries. He likes to see how far he can step over a line before someone insists he retreat. It appears he has chosen Ashbourne as his current experiment. And the letter, Amelia continued. The rider who followed us on the road. None of this feels random. His gaze lifted to meet hers, steady and intent. No, it does not. Which is why I will not allow these games to continue. He folded the scrap of cloth and set it aside. Your family will be moved to a safer property under my name within the week. I will increase security around the house and grounds. She hesitated. Will that be enough? If he is willing to set small things in motion here, what might he do elsewhere? There was a pause in which she could almost see him weighing options, lines of decision branching out in his mind. It may not be enough to simply react, he admitted. At some point, one must address the source. That afternoon, Lady Margaret found Amelia in the picture gallery, standing before a tall window that looked out toward the cliffs. The sea beyond was restless, sunlight catching on the waves like scattered pieces of glass. You have the look of someone who is trying to see more than one thing at once, Lady Margaret remarked gently. The view, and something beyond it. Do you ever wish this house could speak plainly? Amelia asked. That it would simply tell us what actually happened instead of leaving us to wander through its shadows. Lady Margaret gave a faint smile. If houses could talk, my dear, I suspect most of us would never sleep. What troubles you now? Amelia considered how much to say, then decided that pretending would be more exhausting than honesty. She told Lady Margaret about the scrap of fabric, about the ride, about the sense that Everett's presence and the recent events were tightly woven together. The older woman listened with a stillness that felt like support rather than judgment. Everett has always had an appetite for risk, Lady Margaret said at last. He enjoys pushing people toward edges, real or imagined. Your husband once trusted him more than was wise. That trust was not returned in kind. Was he involved with Eliza? Amelia asked quietly. The question had stood between them for days, and it seemed pointless to keep walking around it. Lady Margaret's eyes grew distant for a moment. He was attentive, she said. Too attentive at times. Eliza was restless at Ashbourne. She liked the attention. She liked the way Everett spoke as if the world were a game and nothing truly serious. It made her feel light, until it did not. Things grew more complicated than either of them could manage, and when it all ended, people needed someone simple to blame. And Damien accepted that blame, Amelia said. To shield her, or to shield someone. To shield several people, Lady Margaret replied. He believed he could carry the worst of it. He misjudged how much weight that would become. As the day edged toward evening, clouds gathered over the sea, turning the water a darker gray. A wind picked up, brushing against the windows and stirring the trees along the cliffs. The house seemed to listen, its old stones aware of the change. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. Only a few close associates remained on the estate, among them Lord Everett, who had delayed his departure with the sort of ease that made refusal seem almost impolite. He was charming over the soup, attentive during the main course, his conversation filled with stories of town life and politics. Yet every so often, Amelia caught him watching her with that same considering look, as if he were measuring how far she might bend before she would refuse. When the meal ended and the small party moved toward the drawing room, Everett approached her near the doorway, his voice pitched low. Your Grace, I was telling Lady Fairweather about the view from the cliffs, he said pleasantly. It is spectacular at dusk, especially when the tide is turning. You must see it properly someday. The cliffs are beautiful, Amelia agreed cautiously. But they can be unpredictable. That is their charm, he replied. Life would be dreadfully dull if we only ever stood where the ground was safest, do you not think? Before she could answer, Damien joined them, his presence arriving with the quiet certainty of someone who did not need to announce himself. "The tide is strong this week," he said. "I would not recommend wandering too close to the edge." Everett's smile did not falter, but something in his eyes cooled. "Always the careful guardian," he said lightly. "You should enjoy your good fortune, Ashbourne. You have a wife who attracts attention simply by entering a room. Not every man is blessed with such a gift." Damien's gaze did not leave Everett's face. "A gift can turn quickly to a vulnerability in the wrong company," he said, his tone still polite but edged with meaning. "I make it a habit to know which is which." There was a pause, and Amelia felt as though the entire room was balanced on a very fine line. Then Everett laughed, a sound that was just a shade too smooth. "We must not let caution ruin the evening," he said. "I will leave you to your duties as host." He moved away, joining a small group near the fireplace, his voice soon rising again in entertaining stories. Yet the conversation lingered in Amelia's mind. Later, when she stood near a window and looked out toward the dark outline of the cliffs, she sensed that the house was not merely holding its breath. It was waiting. Somewhere between the restless sea and the locked west wing, between anonymous letters and scraps of fabric and half-truth stories, a turning point was approaching. She could feel it as clearly as the change in the wind, and she knew that when it came, she would have to decide not only whom to trust, but whether she was willing to step away from the safety of silence and name what she saw forming around them. The turning point came on a day when the sky could not decide between sun and storm. Clouds moved in restless layers above Ashbourne, and the wind carried the taste of rain without ever fully committing to it. Amelia found Damien in the small sitting room that overlooked the cliffs, a place where the windows framed the sea like a moving painting. Papers were spread on the low table before him, neat stacks of ledgers and correspondence that looked more like a battlefield than any field of grass and stone. He looked up as she entered, and there was a seriousness in his face that told her he had already reached some decision. "Your family has arrived safely at the northern property," he said without preamble. "They are well housed, and there is a physician in the village who will see to your mother if needed. I received word this morning." Relief moved through her in a soft wave. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know you had no obligation beyond the contract, but you chose to go further." "Some obligations change their shape," he replied. "There are debts I am still choosing to pay." He gestured to the papers. "These are records that tie Everett to the purchase and transfer of your father's debts, and to several other families who were placed in similarly desperate positions. He has been using the fear attached to my name as a tool for his own advantage. It is a pattern I will no longer tolerate." Amelia stepped closer, reading the careful notations, the dates and signatures that connected in clear lines. "You intend to confront him," she said. It was not a question. "Not with whispers," Damien answered. "With facts. He believes he can move in shadows while others take the blame. It is time that pattern is reversed." The opportunity came that evening when Everett, still a guest under the pretense of extended business, suggested a walk along the cliffs before dinner. "I always find it clears the mind," he said with an easy smile. "There is nothing quite like the view when the tide is turning." Amelia felt the familiar flicker of unease, but this time she did not step back. "I would like that," she replied evenly, then turned to Damien. "If you would join us, perhaps we can finally speak plainly about matters that have remained too long beneath the surface." Everett's eyes narrowed just a fraction, but his smile did not falter. The three of them walked along the well-worn path that edged the cliffs, keeping a careful distance from the drop. The sea below moved in steady, powerful surges, the foam tracing white lines where water met rock. The wind tugged at Amelia's skirts, and she placed a hand lightly on the low stone boundary that marked the safest point. Damien walked at her other side, his presence solid and calm. For a few moments they spoke of neutral things, the changing currents and the weather, as if they were three acquaintances enjoying a pleasant view. Then Amelia reached into her glove and drew out the folded scrap of fabric, the one she had taken from the nail near the stable door. She held it where the wind could not snatch it away. "I believe this belongs to you, Lord Everett," she said. "It matches the trim on the cloak you wore the night of the gathering." His gaze dropped to the cloth, then rose back to her face with a touch of amusement that did not reach his eyes. "Many garments share similar details, Duchess." It would be a very thin line on which to hang a conclusion. If it were only this, Damien said calmly, I might agree. But there are also letters and financial records, and a series of events that grow less accidental with every connection. Everett's expression cooled. You have been busy. I have been forced to be observant, Damien replied. There was the matter of the anonymous warning to my wife, the rider who followed her on the road, the small fire in the stable yard that began where no lantern should have been. And then there is the history you share with this house, which you know I have chosen not to parade before the world out of consideration for those who cannot defend themselves. Amelia held his gaze. You stood at the edge of this estate once before, she said softly, with a young woman who felt trapped and restless. She looked to you for escape, and instead she found a path that ended in grief. People have allowed the story to rest on Damien's shoulders because he did not argue. But you and I both know that influence is a kind of responsibility. For the first time, Everett's charming facade wavered. A flicker of something like regret passed through his features before he smoothed it away. You speak with conviction, Duchess, he said. One might think you were present. I have listened, she answered, to the silences as much as to the words. Houses remember, as you once said. They remember who encouraged whom to take risks near edges. The wind rose, carrying the steady roar of the sea upward. Damien's voice cut through it, low and even. Here are your choices, Everett. You will leave Ashbourne today and remove yourself from the affairs of this county. In return, I will resolve certain matters quietly and ensure that your more questionable dealings do not become common knowledge at every table that once welcomed you. If you remain, I will place these records before those who will be very interested to see how you have profited from the misfortune of others under the cover of my reputation. Silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of water and air and the faint call of distant birds. Everett looked from Damien to Amelia, his gaze searching for a sign of hesitation. He found none. At last he inclined his head, the gesture sharp and controlled. You have learned to use the weight of your name differently, Ashbourne, he said. Perhaps that is for the best. Consider this my farewell to your generous hospitality. He turned and walked back along the path without another word, his figure growing smaller against the gray light until he disappeared beyond the rise. For a long moment, Amelia and Damien stood side by side, watching the place where the land met the sky. You could have done this years ago, she said quietly. Why now? Because until now, I was willing to bear the cost alone, he replied. But when his choices began to touch you, and your family, the equation changed. I will accept many things, Amelia. I will not accept your safety being treated as a piece on someone else's board. Her hand moved almost on its own, finding his and guiding it, just as she had on their wedding night, to rest lightly over her heart. The contact was steady and sure, the warmth of his palm grounding her in a way that words could not.